Any Yanks in? Any Americans here? I know one over there. A few Americans. Okay. The condition of the subject in the English department at Enfield College in Western Massachusetts is habitually fraught. In the current culture wars, the English department faculty is factionalized between the old guard professors who teach literature with a capital L as high art, and the avant-garde who teach almost anything that had ever appeared in print and have completely discredited the idea of art. The avant-garde contingent is led by Professor Sally Chenille, a specialist in sexuality whose hair color changes weekly. Sally's latest book, Writing on the Body, had a brief notoriety in the media as exemplifying everything that's gone wrong with postmodern intellectual discourse. She'd gotten an NEH grant to write this study of the textual significance of body-piercing tattooing, scarifaction, and personal branding, and now the Christian right was up in arms about the debased use of their sacred tax dollars. Other department members at Enfield, the usual crew, as one assistant professor comments, specialists in queer studies, postmodernism, postcolonialism, post-Shakespeare studies, neo-Shakespeare studies, and animality. At the University of the Midwest in Minnesota, the English department is housed in a tower. On the 8th floor of the tower is the office of the department chairman, Anthony Pescascani, an Italian-American native of Hoboken, New Jersey, with a leonine sweep of black hair, Gucci clothes, and an air of hoodlum rage. Described in the New York Times as the bastard offspring of Tony Soprano and Elaine Showalter. Pescascani is the author of a celebrated dissertation on Milton called To Reign in Hell, and a more recent book called Screw Free Speech. Pescascani is also widely quoted as having said, "The finest thing in life is to take an academic department and bend it to one's will." In the basement of the English department in Midwest are the pale women of the composition program, the Morlocks of the Eloy world, or perhaps the bloodless female mill workers in Melville's short story, The Tartarus of Maids. In each cubicle, a thin woman in thrift shop couture sits earnestly tutoring some groggy student. Most of the comp teachers were divorced moms and single women with cats who taught 8 classes a year and earned $1,000 per class. They were the steerage of the English department, the first to drown if the budget sprang a leak. At yet another Midwestern university, the English department is sandwiched into 2 hallways, surrounded by science and engineering students, recognizable by their calculators and sense of purpose. No one knows what to do with English anymore, or where it fits. A capacious field, the chair of the department calls it at the spring quarter assembly. The English department is given all the bad office equipment and old furniture, while the business students, the medical students, the engineering students move school of study from time to time into new buildings with green-tinted glass. The students in our capacious field are recognizable for their looks of envied hopelessness. If they are lucky, they will get a job in another neglected English department, maybe in Alaska, Tennessee, or South Dakota. Of course, Enfield, Midwest, and the others are not real English departments. These are fictional English departments, described respectively by Joanne Dobson, James Hines, and Sharon Olson in their academic novels in the 1990s. 2 of these, in fact, Joanne Dobson and Sharon Olson, are English professors moonlighting as novelists. James Hines is a philosopher. But I suspect that most of us, and certainly the Americans here, will recognize the authenticity of these descriptions. Ours is the academic environment of which Franklin Tricchia, all too real a presence in the English department at Duke, writes, "I teach English in a distinguished university. In my distinguished department, which is like all English departments I have known or heard about We have nothing in common, not even literature. Andrew Del Banco in the English department at Columbia observes in the New York Review of Books in 1999, everyone knows that if you want to locate the laughingstock on your local campus these days, your best bet is to stop by the English department. In fact, not even the fictional Enfield approaches reality. Not even Enfield has a professor of disability studies, the latest of the hot specialisms in the field. But in the most recent issue of the American journal Pedagogy, there is an inspiring account of an English department course on gay and disability studies at a real Midwestern university, team taught by a late blooming lesbian and her partially deaf partner, which ends in a triumph of successful learning. I quote from the professor's joint account of the students' joyful efforts to adopt a queer identity. By the end of the quarter, several students had switched their sexual identification from heterosexual to lesbian, end of quote. Now, it was not a complete success. None of the students had actually come out as deaf. But one who started the term as a white heterosexual woman did finish as a Filipino-American disabled lesbian. And some people think English is ineffective. Now, full disclosure at the beginning, I have just taken early retirement from Princeton. But very little of what I'm going to say about the future of English this morning in American universities applies to Princeton specifically. And I want to be on record as saying, and you've all heard me, that the Princeton English department is no laughing matter. I say this not simply because Princeton, or not because Princeton is immune to the problems of mere ordinary American English departments. It is not. And I say it not only because my former department chairman is going to be here today, but because Princeton, for the foreseeable future, is just so rich in material resources and in students and faculty that the problems that affect many other American colleges and universities just don't impinge on it and probably won't. My views are meant to be national rather than local, collective rather than individual. And overall, the condition of English in American universities seems to me parlous and racked with problems without conviction, shared purpose, or intellectual continuity. This sort of conference would not take place in the United States. I agree with Jonathan Bate that we are not standing on a ladder of fact, certainty, consensus, or skills, but on an airy scaffolding of skepticism and suspicion. But in the United States, first of all, no one would say that in public. And secondly, I see this epistemological condition leading to existential and pragmatic problems around issues of enrollment, curriculum, graduate education, hiring, publication, and teaching. Most sadly, those in positions of putative leadership in the profession either lack the will to change or lead in encouraging everyone else to exercise denial, to find scapegoats in the administration of the government, to look for subsidies and artificial remedies, usually in more money. Give us the money, show us the money. That is basically what you're going to hear at American conferences on the subject. Or more sanctions, let's punish people who are doing this to us. In other words, a combination of carrots and sticks rather than substantive solutions that come out of collective self-examination and intellectual determination. At the same time, this is the good news about which I'll say something at the end, the technological revolution flourishing in the United States, especially the use of email and interactive educational software, which is being widely used by many members of English departments individually, I think is the most exciting development in teaching literature ever. I think it is going to totally revolutionize our discipline in the 20th century, and I think that although there is no discussion at the top and no theoretical discussion and no effort to consider the future of the subject or the condition of the subject, there's a possibility that what will be percolating up from individual practice is something more positive than the kind of theoretical and collective situation that I see and that I'm going to describe. Now, I don't want this to be a kind of personal diatribe, and a lot of what I'm going to say relies on the testimony of my countrymen and women and of others in the field, rather than of my personal opinion. So I'm going to quote a lot of people, and the point of that is really to give you a sense of how widespread agreement is on these issues, and yet, to my mind, how very little is being done to address them. Some of the most trenchant analyses of the state of English come from former English professors who have now become administrators, professors who have moved up to become deans or even college and university presidents, and seen for the first time with some shock how the English department looks from the higher perspective of the university. In spring 2002, the bulletin, the periodical of the ADE, which is the Associated Departments of English of the MLA, it's the part of the MLA that English departments belong to versus the foreign languages, and of course it's enormous. The bulletin published a special issue on the future of English. Several contributors to this issue referred to the work of the late Bill Reddings on the demise of the University of Culture, in which it's assumed that the study of literature is an essential, unavoidable aspect of a humanistic education, and the University of Excellence, in which English departments must defend and explain what they do and show that they do it excellently. Elaine Hansen was a professor of English and then the provost at Haverford College, and is now president of Bates College in Maine. She writes a summary of how chief academic officers regard English departments. On the positive side, good teachers, high course enrollments, inexpensive to run, no labs, no startup funds. On the negative side, although people in English departments are admired for their verbal skills and cleverness, they are also seen as destructive, endlessly contentious, nitpicking, and pretentious. They have big egos and do a lot of posturing. They tend to be more sensitive than other faculty members, more prickly, more prone to attribute major symbolic importance to individual decisions. She concludes, English as a discipline is well known for its controversies, and, on the contrary, or opposed to this, the evident lack of a shared purpose. And Hansen, who spent 20 years herself as a professor of English in an English department, says, it seems as if many departments are circling empty wagons around a vacant lot. In another essay I was especially struck by, Jonathan Culler, who you might say has been, an faculty member of English, the English department at Cornell, who is now the Associate Dean of Arts and Sciences, writes, as a dean, I have been struck by how much better other departments are at presenting a united front to the administration, with well-motivated requests for resources for particular purposes. Sometimes English departments are so contentious and suspicious of authority that they may actually resist a dean's desire to give them resources for a senior appointment. Obviously, they have to decide what field the appointment is going to be in. Such internal divisions or contentions may have been a charming idiosyncrasy of English departments in the University of Culture, but they are a serious obstacle in the University of Excellence, where the emptiness of the idea of excellence means that if the department itself will not define excellence, that is, set goals, measure their achievement, someone else will define it for them. Just about everybody agrees that English departments and the condition of our subject need some support. Let me just give you a kind of overview of the current situation of English studies in American higher education. The number of undergraduates majoring in English has been declining since 1972. In 1997, only 4 out of 100 bachelor's degrees were awarded in English, a drop of almost 50% from the 70s. Overall, enrollments in the humanities have been dropping as well. This decline is often masked because overall undergraduate enrollments have been expanding. A lot of new students, new kinds of students have been coming into the university, and they are taking lower level and even some higher level courses in English, but they're not taking it up as a major subject. So we teach more and more students in English because there are more and more students in our colleges and universities, but we do not attract a growing percentage of them to specialize. Linda Ray Pratt, formerly the president of the Associated Departments of English and now dean of the University of Nebraska, notes, the future of English may depend in part on what we define and defend as the value of the study. But the future will also be profoundly influenced by developments over which we are likely to have little or no control. Discussing the high-minded debate over the future of the discipline with its terminology of ruin, wreck, or corruption, she warns we must confront the growing irrelevance of English. It's not that it's ruined or destroyed and we have a great empire which has fallen, it's that nobody cares. The growing irrelevance of English to the major developments in many of our institutions. The public and our students place a waning value on a liberal arts education, and the research of agendas of our institutions are increasingly set by the pursuit of finding resources and reputational ratings. Pratt points out there is little way for English or the humanities in general to play a significant role when external research grants begin to reshape the university. And she argues that our conversations about the future of English must look beyond our boundaries at how liberal arts education is changing and what role in the contemporary university we can fulfill. This survey is certainly not taking place among the faculty within departments. English faculty in the United States are still, in my experience, coming from positions of entitlement, behaving as if they were still in the University of Culture. And us, them thinking, in other words, it is we embattled few, we happy few, we cultivated, refined, educated, humanistic few against those greedy capitalists over in the administration. That kind of thinking, rather than any planning on how to be useful and relevant, dominates any discussion that takes place. I have heard many faculty protesting with great rhetorical bombast that we simply deserve to be as well supported as the sciences, blithely ignoring two crucial facts about the sciences in the universities. And in American universities, I'm sure it's the same case, they largely pay their own way through grants, including the indirect costs, and they offer cumulative and progressive knowledge, or claim to do so. One area where the American discipline of English studies seems fragmented, particularly, is the curriculum, or the design and objectives of what students could study and learn. The invigorating discussion of these past few days of where English studies in higher education should begin, and how the study of English language and corpus linguistics, Ron Carter's very exciting talk, textual editing, and literary biography, the matters that Jonathan Bates spoke about, the cultural criticism that Kate Belzy discussed. That entire discussion is very different from the prevailing discourse in the States. In the past, one department chair notes, we justified the professionalization of English on some version of objectivity and method and progress in knowledge as the end product. But once deconstruction and post-structuralism triumphed, such rationales were impossible. And as Luke Manan says, the grounds for disciplinarity, no grounds for disciplinarity remained. At departmental level, collective discussions of disciplinarity in the curriculum have been virtually abandoned. And my authority for this is David Lawrence, who has been for over 15 years the director of English programs and the Association of Departments of English for the MLA. In other words, he is the MLA staff member who coordinates all of the activities of the Departments of English across the nation. So he is very experienced in attending meetings and hearing from a very, very wide variety of English faculty members. And he reports in an article called The Latest Forecast, which was also in spring 2002, that now what we have is basically an intellectually, historically, and aesthetically informed sort of messing about with literature. Lawrence reports that as he listens to members talk about life in their departments, an anecdotal impression emerges of departments experiencing high and increasing degrees of intellectual fragmentation and organizational atomization. In a significant number of departments, it seems the discussion of curriculum, considered as a collective intellectual and educational project, has reached an impasse. The conflicting perspectives and claims of competing interest groups seem impossible to reconcile. And yet, as Lawrence asks, can a collection or accumulation of courses developed out of the uncoordinated choices of faculty members stand as a curriculum, however brilliantly taught and artful in conception the courses may be? It becomes harder to explain how a course contributes to the development of student understanding in the area of study represented by the department, why the department needs these courses rather than those, or why certain courses and faculty positions cannot be dispensed with. Jonathan Culler, Dean Jonathan Culler, too, is puzzled by the inability of American English departments to try to design sequences of courses that are attractive to students. Many other departments, he says, especially the science departments, are better than English in presenting sequences that encourage students to take more than one course. English departments, by contrast, tend to offer a pathless wilderness of courses with no logic that pulls students from one course to another. The way many departments handle sequence and progress is to compel majors, students who have already signed on for the full Monty, simply to take courses that are unpopular, either because of their subject matter or their teachers, or both. In other words, rather than rethink a sequence, reimagine a subject or period, or focus on teaching methods, departments subsidize weak fields and weak faculty. I might add that I've never heard any of my colleagues so much as mention David Lawrence's report, and I have to suppose that they didn't read it, which is one way of dealing with bad news. There is a good deal of talk, and even a little action on American campuses with regard to pedagogy. Everyone pays lip service to pedagogy, and many campuses now have teaching centers. But even where universities offer such opportunities and facilities, faculty largely spurn and ignore them. At Princeton, the McGraw Center for Teaching and Learning offers excellent seminars and workshops, but they're usually attended by fewer than a dozen faculty out of a community of close to 1,000. And I noticed in the reports that the English Subject Center, too, actually had to cancel some workshops on teaching at various universities in the UK because of low pre-enrollments. Among drawbacks to serious consideration of literary pedagogy are the attitudes of some of those in the profession who have presented themselves as experts on pedagogy. One example is John Guillory, who I think is now writing a book about pedagogy in American universities, in English departments. Guillory's views of what he calls the pedagogic imaginary are discouraging at best and woefully ill-informed at worst. With friends like him, teaching needs no enemies. In The Very Idea of Pedagogy, published in 2002, Guillory concludes that he's skeptical of any effort to raise scholarship on the teaching of literature to a level as sophisticated and interesting as the scholarship that takes literature as its object. Now, plainly, John Guillory and I are not reading the same scholarship. Where is all this interesting, sophisticated work on literature? And I'll come back to that point in a minute. Nonetheless, faculty are complacent in their belief that they can keep their classroom practice private, but they are wrong, and they are facing a new set of external circumstances. As the New York Times reported just this spring, one of the fastest growing developments in the States are web businesses on the internet devoted to professorial evaluation. In other words, companies that are starting up to do course evaluations, put them on the internet to which students can subscribe, and which they are subscribing to in great numbers. Now, many colleges and universities run their own rating and evaluation systems, but for those that do not or will not, students can now choose from pickaprof.com, professorperformance.com, ratingsonline.com, and ratemyprofessors.com. On most campuses, the way they work is that on most campuses that use them, the student government pays $5,000 to $10,000 a year for the service, and all students are free to record their comments in professor evaluations, and I think this is the wave of the future. Faculty complain, of course, that what this means is that students are looking for easy courses. At the moment, basic reaction in the States to these developments is what I believe to be a false and distracting fuss about grade inflation. Students grades are getting too high. Student grades are too high, not enough students are failing the courses for it to be taken seriously, and students are only looking for an easy A. But I hope that these technological developments may yet spur some interest from faculty in researching and improving their own teaching and using the teaching and learning centers that are made available to them in which to do this. We do know that teaching and learning are domain specific, and so it's very important for English professors to get together within our field, within our discipline, to talk about teaching methods. It can't be simply generic. Lee Shulman of the Carnegie Foundation has explained different disciplines value particular forms of evidence and argument, narrative and explanation. Their pedagogies reflect these different forms of substance and syntax. But in the discipline of English studies, substance is much discussed. Syntax and its relation to teaching and learning, almost never. Issues of content are always engaged, but without a historical dimension, evidence of effective teaching, in other words, research about what works and what doesn't, or reference to other pedagogical research. Although interdisciplinarity has certainly affected the discussion and is much talked about and much praised and much celebrated, often what interdisciplinarity means is a form of parallel play. We will do our interdisciplinarity over here, and you do your interdisciplinarity over there, but we're not really going to do it together. The least examined part of the field, and the most neglected in terms of pedagogy, is graduate education. In a recent article in the Chronicle of Higher Education, this was in June this year, called So You Want to Go to Grad School, Thomas Benton gives, I think, a very painful and scabrous, but I think very accurate response to the question of an undergraduate, I would like to go to grad school. Don't go to graduate school. But, the student says, I burn with an intense gem-like flame for Victorian poetry. Don't go. But I'm sure I'd love teaching. Why are you really considering graduate school? Well, the student says, to be perfectly honest, I majored in English and I can't find a job. At least not one that pays anything that has health benefits. I'm thinking I can hide out in grad school until the economy gets better. And hey, if I really like it, I can just become a professor, right? Thomas Benton says, if you have a burning passion for Victorian poetry, you better satisfy this passion by yourself. Force yourself to read a few dozen academic books before deciding to dedicate your life to a subject. That's what one does in graduate school anyway. Most learning is unsupervised, independent, and onerous. Why pay or work according to an institutional timetable unless you need an academic credential? I want to say more, but usually refrain. Be wary of people who claim that grad school is a wonderful experience, a means of acquiring the polish of culture, a kind of grand tour. Professionalism obligates people to speak positively about their alma mater in public. Grad school is not all fun and personal enrichment. It can involve poverty-level wages, uncertain employment conditions, contradictory demands by supervisors, irrelevant research projects, and disrespectful treatment by both the tenured faculty and the undergraduates, both of whom behave all too often as management and customers. Grad school is a confidence-killing daily assault of petty degradations, and all this is compounded by the fear that it is all for nothing, that you are a fool. June 2003, pretty heavy-handed. I spoke this month in London to a newly minted PhD in philosophy who's just gotten his first job, and he said the best thing about graduate school, in his opinion, was that it made any subsequent job seem like paradise. But that subsequent job is harder and harder to find. For the past 20 years, the higher education system in the United States has been able to absorb about 400 new PhDs in English annually. 400 real jobs, tenure-track jobs a year. During the same period, the 140-plus degree-granting programs have produced about 1,000 PhDs a year. Moreover, the average length of time to earn a PhD degree is now 8 years. Lives are being wasted in costly pursuit of an impossible goal. In 2002, which is this year, it's the last hiring season in December, job openings in literature and languages fell dramatically, the largest drop in a decade. In 1998, when I was president of the MLA, I warned that the survival of the humanities in higher education depended on the profession's willingness to face reality and determination to change. We knew in 1998, we knew before 1998, that the job market for graduate students had been in crisis for decades. We knew that only 25% of the PhDs in English would ever be tenured faculty. We knew that most of them would not be teaching in research universities, and that their lack of training in teaching and administration was not preparing them for the kind of academic jobs that did exist. We knew then that the highly subsidized system of university publishing of arcane research was nearing financial collapse. Any meaningful change in humanities graduate education, I argued in my MLA presidential address, had to address the ever-increasing length of the time to PhD, a prolonged academic adolescence, which makes graduate study almost a lifetime career itself. We speak about tenured graduate students. All graduate students need to receive formal training in teaching and communications, and those who've made the commitment to go on to the PhD need a variety of teaching experiences. But most important, graduate departments of English face the ethical, economic, and intellectual obligation to offer new graduate students a training in writing, teaching, technology, editing, educational management and administration, as well as literary research, a preparation which could help them become sought-after candidates for a wide variety of serious careers. And in 1998, there are a number of other people in the profession speaking, but very much speaking in the wilderness. Bob Weisbach, who's the president of the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, said, until there is a much more robust set of meaningful job opportunities beyond academia, such as exists for lawyers, engineers, and scientists, we don't think there's going to be a major improvement in support for the humanities. And the Wilson Foundation is offering some pilot programs to help graduate students prepare for these jobs. David Lawrence, again at the ADE, said all responsible institutions need to provide well-supported career development programs for graduate students, which should begin the year graduate study begins, continue annually, and emphasize throughout the full range of employment PhDs have in fact taken up, from business, government, and nonprofits to secondary school teaching. Has any of this happened in your dreams? It has happened. In 1998, these calls for change were met by resistance, anger, and accusations of intellectual betrayal. For Carrie Nelson, who is one of the faculty elected to the MLA Executive Council, now publicly lamenting that his own university is not hiring, the only answer to the problems was the unionization of academic labor. Advocacy for alternative careers outside academia, he wrote, is without question the most cynical, self-interested solution anyone has ever offered to the job crisis. The past 5 years, since 1998, the MLA has conducted costly surveys, passed a score of left-wing resolutions about world political problems, from the Iraq War to racial prejudice, every year at the annual meeting. We have about 20 resolutions, none of which is ever about education, much less anything that goes on in a real department. I mean, they're all about hunger, prejudice, so on, and they are debated, you know, as if it mattered, what we voted on them. And the MLA has also argued and dickered about censuring and punishing individual departments that do not comply with their ideal models of hiring and promotion. Despite some scattered individual efforts to address the long-term issues, energy has gone into bluster, hand-wringing, denial, kvetching, and militance. And yet, while some universities have seen their graduate students affiliate with the United Auto Workers, which is trying to unionize them, others have seen resistance to unionization as a solution to unemployment, and certainly unemployment has not been improved. Without any clear agreement on goals and curriculum, academic employment resembles the search for academic employment is a lottery. The graduate student's choice of specialization is full of anxiety, certainly not a free one, since no one can predict which fields will be in demand 8 years down the road. Publishing. Those who publish literary scholarship are everywhere indicating their despair over its survival and viability, and this was also the gist of the discussion at the conference here, the panel on academic publishing, university press publishing particularly. American university presses can no longer publish the academic monographs and literary studies they used to, because university libraries, their longtime steady market and partners in sin, can no longer afford to buy them, and no one else wants to. In 2000, total output of university presses in the U.S. was 31 million books, of which libraries bought 5 million. In order to reach market equilibrium, in the United States would have to buy 26 university press books a year. But in fact, most academics don't want to read these books, much less to buy them. Stephen Greenblatt, the current president of the MLA, says in his presidential address, he says mildly, quite an understatement, somewhere over the past decade, our interest in one another's work seems to have declined. Indeed, the equivalent of sexual dysfunction, lack of desire. Now, why could this be? Some scholars and theorists argue it's because our work is so ephemeral. Bob Scholes is among those who point out that we're estranged from the possibility of truth. And so instead of scholarship that will lead progressively toward knowledge, we have a conversation in which the best rewards go to the best conversationalists. And how much conversation do you need? How much can you afford at, 30 or 40 pounds a pop, or, 40 pounds for an academic university press book? Having largely given up on research as a progress towards truth, the results of our research are rarely important to anyone, not even to many of the scholars who work in the field of that research. That's what academics are saying. Editors and publishing executives are much more forthright about the reasons for the decline of interest, the utter dreariness and insularity of much academic writing in the humanities. Mary Morell, the senior humanities editor at Princeton University Press, writes in PMLA in 2001, in an article called "As Literary Studies Become," that we now have books without a market large enough to sustain them. And she says we have to reinvent scholarly writing, and writers need to become acutely conscious of the reader as the other, not a familiar colleague, but a sympathetic stranger, indeed a couple of thousand sympathetic strangers. This approach to writing will demand modifications to style as in subject matter. In other words, we have to speak to a real audience and be able to hold their interest. Bill Germano, the VP of Rutledge, is even more direct. He asks, why are dissertations so dull? This was in an article about last week, the Chronicle of Higher Education. Why are dissertations so dull? And he says, fault within the genre can be disentangled from the institutions that summon the genre into being to begin with. In short, the very English departments insisting on books for promotion are not training their graduate students how to write anything publishable. The dissertation is narrow, a niche genre. Why, Germano asks, encourage doctoral students in literature to produce yet one more manuscript that nudges forward some sort of theory in the big opening number, followed by 4 or 5 chapters, each of which is a close reading of a single text, purportedly reinforcing what was proposed at the start. If you're writing such a dissertation, you'll have a hard time publishing it. What departments need to teach their graduate students, Germano declares, is instruction on writing an article for publication, instruction in planning that someone other than a committee might care about, instruction in how to maneuver quickly and safely through book publishing's hoops, instruction on how to revise one's work 5 times, not get sick of it, and realize that the result is where every grindingly tedious moment spent. Excellent advice, I think, and certainly here and there, English faculty trying on their own, often against department resistance, to carry out this mission. But what's the wisdom of the profession as a whole? Well, a number of committees and commissions have been formed in the U.S., mostly within the MLA, to consider the crisis in publishing. And this is what they say. In fall 2002, the Executive Committee of the MLA proposed that the solution to the publishing crisis was for all track positions in language and literature to be accompanied by a $5,000 to $7,000 book subvention. In other words, each new assistant professor who's hired is given $5,000 to $7,000 by the university to publish a book. That way, everyone who can produce a manuscript, and not everybody can get it into print and qualify for tenure. And this spring, the editor of PMLA, Carlos Alonso, wrote approvingly, the proposal that universities create a publication subvention for junior faculty members shows an inventiveness to which we should all aspire when dealing with the institutional problems that afflict us. Show us the money, show us the money. Okay, I mean, perfect, it's a great solution, very inventive. No press can afford to publish our books. Universities should pay to have them published. Make the English department a big vanity press. Well, okay, then get published, but who's going to buy them? Are they going to rot in the warehouses? What are we going to do with all those books that nobody wants to read? Steve Greenblatt has a great solution. In his presidential address, published in the new PMLA, he proposes English departments should give graduate students a subvention to buy the books. Wonderful. So the assistant professors are subsidized to publish the books. The graduate students are subsidized to buy them. But obviously, still, who's going to read them? The undergraduate's going to read them. And how are we going to do this? We're going to assign books, everybody's books, to the undergraduates, so they're required to read them. But if that doesn't work, maybe we could pay the undergraduates to read them. And I see a sort of sliding scale that would be linked to the total unreadability of the book in question. The only good thing about these proposals, in my view, is that the the MLA has absolutely no clout with the university. We can put out these proposals until the cows come home, and nothing whatsoever is going to happen. So it seems to me that as absurd as they are, they will have no influence whatsoever. So to conclude, is the condition of the subject in American universities terminal? Yes and no. It does seem to me that English American universities is a headless chicken, but it is a very lively chicken. It doesn't know that it's terminal. It's running around and doing very well. I mean, the difference, one of the huge difference, of course, is American educated private. Even when it is public, it is not centralized. There is a way to get all American universities to come together, departments to come together and act in a collective way. So change is going to happen much more slowly. And right now, there is no leadership, there's no voice, there's no institution which is really speaking for the kinds of interests that are being addressed at this conference. On the other hand, and this is just to end with the good news, English as a discipline still continues to show considerable signs of life, despite having, no vital bodily organs at all. It attracts the best of the undergraduates. We still have to turn away students who want to come into graduate study. Faculty are dedicated and imaginative. Almost in every college and university, the English department has a reputation for having the best teachers. People are devoted, imaginative, resourceful. And as someone said, somebody I quote in my book, Teaching Literature, from the beginning of the century, of all the subjects in the academic pack, we hold the trumps. We have the best material to teach. It's only our fault if we're not doing it well. So there is something positive at the end. I do think that English in the American university is going to have a future. What I am worried about is whether it's going to have a destiny, whether it's going to have a goal. And on that point of question, I will end and invite responses. Thank you.
We do. We have about 20 minutes, actually, for questions. 15, 20 minutes.
Yeah.
What would you say with the sense that one of our problems is the absolute isolation of university English teachers from secondary English teachers? That there seems to be very little interaction. They live in two entirely different universes. And that one of the ways to solve at least a few of the problems that you talked about is, for example, some of our graduate students to try to teach a secondary English class for even a week. They would find that they would have to adjust their teaching methods and so on very radically in a different way. What would be your response to something like that?
Well, I think it would be a very good idea. I mean, I'd like to see it happen. It isn't happening, as you know very well. I think it's a very good idea, and I think it's just one of the issues, and I think people recognize this. But nothing really changes. I mean, there seems to be very little incentive to change at the moment that is being addressed. If it isn't being addressed at the top, all we really have is the MLA and the ADE as national organizations. And it is so that their attitude towards it is so consistent. Unionize, get money, deal with it with money, and so far away from what we do. What's going on within? How can we change? How can we address some of the issues of the 21st century? And ironically, paradoxically, I do think because of this new technology, because the fact that there's such unbelievable change in student population, and indeed the teaching population in American universities is so multicultural, we have the opportunity to do something remarkable, extraordinary, completely new. So what I would say is, yes, that's great. How do we think about doing that?
Pete?
I was interested by the, I should have known about this one. You were talking about the University of Excellence compared to the University of Culture. Is that
Right.
Is that? We seem to be in a kind of double bind, at least listening to you and also thinking about our own experience. Insofar as the kinds of virtues and values that you were briefly mentioning at the end are a kind of defence, or that's the position in which one might want to defend English or literature or whatever. But if you can't transpose that into the University of Excellence, then with its the performance indicators and the targets and the thing. Isn't apparently the very essence of the defensive positioning, which it has been a kind of humanist space in the university, and we can go back to Leibniz in fact in terms of what that space might mean. Isn't it precisely going to be defeated by being transliterated, if you like, into the University of Exeter?
Well, I don't think so. I think that's the impasse. I think that's where we've been stuck. But I don't think it is a given that that's where we have to remain stuck. I mean, and I think that some of the discussions over the past couple of days particularly has addressed some of these issues. And we are in a new century. We need to be thinking about the new population of students that we're going to be teaching. We need to be thinking about what they need and also about how the subject has changed. In my own work, my teaching work, I've been using the Blackboard educational software for some years, which I know the number of English universities are using as well. And I think it's just exceptional, particularly in the fact that we have these electronic discussion boards in which students can comment to each other about the reading that they're doing. And I had noticed immediately, and the students have noticed as well, how much it improves the changes they're writing, because they're speaking to a real audience, not to this sort of hypothetical academic ether, you know. And we talked about that. I was fascinated listening to Ron Carter talk about email and about linguistics, to see how there is a sort of study of linguistics and the way email and other kinds of corpora are changing the use of the angles of the language. This seemed to be a perfect example of one new way to begin, maybe in a first year of an English studies program, that students can actually begin to look at the language as it's used, and as they themselves are using it. And it seemed to me that would satisfy in all kinds of ways a lot of the abstractions that come out of pedagogy about active teaching, student-centered learning, and so on. But it was a totally new thought that I had listening to him. And I think that that's really what can happen. That we retain the values of the past, but there are new ways to apply them, and new ways to defend them, and new ways to combine them that required some change from us, rather than just sort of we demand, we respect, give us respect, we're entitled to your respect, and give us a lot of money at the same time, and the problems will go away. I think that's a very self-defeating kind of thinking.
Could you comment a bit on what I'm hearing is kind of a mixed message about the condition of pedagogy? Because on the one hand, you seem to be lamenting the fact that very few people show up for faculty development events, and at the end of your talk, you crowed about the fact that English people are oftentimes the best teachers in the university.
Yeah.
And I know in the backyard in which I'm in, there are people at places like University of Chicago and UIC, Gerald Graff, Wayne Booth, who have really been exemplary in terms of leading faculty development movements and getting colleagues not only in their departments but also across the university to think more seriously about teaching. And so I come down on the side of the fact that English people can be real agents of change in terms of faculty development, but perhaps you're a little bit less optimistic about it.
Well, I mean, hypothetically, I think they are. I mean, I agree. I think the people who teach English often are the best teachers, very committed. There are some people who have forward areas. Certainly, Jerry has a new book called Clueless in Academia, which is about arguing for a particular kind of teaching, which is about arguing. He says argument is the basis of what he calls the game, what we do. We need to teach it. But it seems to me that this kind of individual dedication and imagination and reinvention of the wheel that has gone on among English writers, I think that's had its day. And what I was really wanting to say is, yes, we have incredibly talented, dedicated people, but we haven't moved from that individual culture to something that is more collective, community-based, and corporate. And people haven't made the leap from understanding that as hard as they may work and as much as they may struggle and even as successful as they may be in teaching, they have learned from talking to others and sharing ideas, and that privatized teaching still. And even when people come up against a problem, people who otherwise are the people of the book the last thing they will do is go to the library to see, is there any research about this? Is there anything been published about it? They will stay up all night and torture themselves and maybe call their best friend, but there is no sense that there is a scholarship which can be approached in the way that we approach other kinds of learning. And I don't know, I think this will happen eventually. I know that at Princeton we have the Center for Teaching and Learning, which opened about 2 years ago. And it's, you know, it's very beautiful, it has all kinds of wonderful facilities, it's very well staffed, but nobody goes there. And I was talking to the director, and she said that she had talked to people on other campuses, and they said they estimated it would be 10 years from the time it got going to the time that it would be even minimally functioning. That seems to be, I have to say, and a frustratingly long time to develop that kind of interest. And I would hope it could be speeded up. And I don't see English faculty leading in that development.
I think this may be the same question that each person asked, but I'll try to make a different form of it, because you're advocating, I mean, what you just called collectivization, or a single head for this head as a chicken, or a destiny, or a goal. For a subject, the virtue of which, as you defined in your last supposal thought, is its pluralism, you know, is the intensity of debate that arises out of the strong personal enthusiasms of teachers. And, I mean, of course, that could be a workable paradox, but, I mean, the word collectivization is particularly obvious, isn't it? And I wonder whether the challenge is rather to be more persuasive and articulate about the value of that very pluralism, of precisely the incoherence of an English programme, which, after all, I think is quite a strong part of what does attract students to it.
Well, I guess I don't agree, although I very much respond. I mean, you know, I'm the generation that sort of was attracted to these reasons too. So, I mean, you know, I can't help but understand. But I think that there is also a split here between thinking about ourselves, thinking about students, thinking about what students need. And I don't think that there's any real contradiction between maintaining the kind of openness and vitality and spontaneity and freewheelingness, all the things that Kate Belzy was talking about, and sort of taking in all kinds of elements of culture. I think you can do that with structuring it in a way that makes it meaningful to students. And that's what I mean by the collective approach. I don't mean, you know, collective in the old-timey political sense, but I think the way the curriculum is developed so much in American universities is I teach what I want, you teach what you want, we don't bother each other. Okay. But at a certain point, I think you begin to get a very incoherent mass of courses that do not present themselves offering anything cumulative and progressive to students. And without completely receiving something empirical, obviously we can't do. It does seem to me that paths can be established. I do think education in the UK or in Australia or in Canada generally does this much better than in the States. The States is the most anarchic of all the higher educational format. And I think this is not to the benefit of students. I know that students look at the sequence of courses, they can't understand what is this sequence? There really is no sequence. Why do you have to learn this before you learn that? What is it that you're learning, you know, at the 100 level that appears at the 200 level? And I think it's time to sort of...
So what has particularly intensified that effect here, of course, is modularization.
I know.
Yeah, and perhaps it's at that structural level that needs to be looked at.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I've looked at like the curriculum or catalog in Australian universities, and I'm sure that Australian academics find these requirements extremely annoying and wish they would go away. I look at them and I see how every course has some sort of description that relates it to the topic as a whole, that relates it to the previous year and the next year, that relates it to the other courses in the same year. And I'm sure writing those things up, people are just cursing and raging, wishing they didn't have to do it, and they may be very mechanical. And yet the thinking that's gone into that is something which I envy very much. And I think it would make it I think that would make it more attractive to students and to the administration to be able to say, this is where we're going, this is what we're building. But here are all of these this was a large building site.
Okay, there are several questions waiting over here first.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit about this idea of a sequence that you mentioned.
Yeah.
How would sequencing, for example, and there should be, I agree with you, more conversation amongst faculty in the American English departments, but how would sequencing, for example, translate those 400 tenure track jobs into 1,000? Or how would it create within such English for students passing out of undergraduate programs, unless, again, they were in publishing, in editing, in IT, or whatever? I think part of the crisis, of course, is this idea of how it translates into hard professions. You've got those dentists and physicians you visit, or accountants who say, my favorite course from my undergraduate education is my English course. The thing was that it wouldn't pay me what I get paid as an accountant or a banker or whatever, otherwise I would have proceeded in that field. So, although I think you're right in terms of pointing out that the crisis is, sort of domestically within the English departments, I think part of it is also what's out there as well for people coming out.
Well, I really agree, and I want to suggest that having a sequence of courses in the curriculum is going to solve the problem of employment. I don't think it will. I'm putting all of these areas together, crisis, partly because there are many of them, and I think they all contribute to the sense of ferment and difficulty. But they don't all have the same solution. What interests me is that at the moment they're all being met as if they could have the same solution, which is money and sanctions. On the one hand, you come up with more money. On the other hand, you force people somehow to do these things, rather than saying, how can we look at ourselves? Can we look internally and see what we could do or do, just to change some of these situations? In terms of the job market, I really think that we are simply producing too many PhDs destined for the academy. Not too many PhDs per se. I think having a PhD in English is a wonderful thing. I think it is extraordinarily good training. I think that it is intellectually demanding. There is one kind of approach to this which talks for academic birth control, kind of Malthusian answer, which is that you should accept a lot fewer students. And I think that's sort of cutting off our noses to spite our faces. We should have lots of students. If students want to come and study English literature at an advanced level, this is wonderful. Let's have them. That provides opportunities for us to teach the things we love. I think it will be good for them. But let's not tell them that they're going to be tenured professors. From the very beginning, let's sort of say to them, there are a lot of things you can do with this training, and we will help hear you those things, and we will help the credentials that we need, and we will publicize this to the rest of the world. Because in fact, in American universities, there's about a 50% dropout rate anyway, so about 50% of the people who start American PhD programs do go on to do other things. Indeed.
Yeah, I wanted to I wanted to talk about publishing. I think I would disagree with you on one point. I think it should be made more difficult to publish rather than easy. I think it should be actually made extremely more stringent. The standard should be more difficult to publish a monograph than the other way around. But connected to that, the academic and English departments should also devise different ways of assessing professors for tenure. This emphasis on publish or perish, especially a book or a monograph, is actually leading to a proliferation of, as you said, people just talking to themselves. Really. So they write a book which is actually unreadable except by their own selves and maybe a few friends. But to change the means by which the faculty access, there's certain key idea that we take for granted in English departments itself has to be addressed. Somehow, when they have an innate, their geniuses innately, they don't need development. They don't need development.
Yeah.
In fact, that is why they're high. They're high because they are fully formed. They need good development. Whereas, in fact, in the experiences of most of us, it is the interaction at various levels with colleagues and even administration. We all detest administration, but there's so much that you can learn being on committees about rhetorical styles and other. Now all these things, but it takes a longer gestation period. It takes a long gestation period to take into account about the environment that helps the individual scholar to develop themselves more fully. So the second thing is that in terms of publishing and assessing publication, I think there will be some value of greater collaborative work. Because in fact, often what happens is that 5 people publish on Victorian poetry, and they are actually saying the same thing. Or they repeat themselves. They echo themselves. Why not encourage a greater, when I say collaboration, I don't mean the other thing that I think is very worrisome, the anthologies. There are so many anthologies that come out. They have their value, but that's not what I mean. I mean collaboration. So 2 or 3 people get together and work on a project together. There will be exchange of ideas, and then they publish one of them. Then the assessment of assistant professors for tenure should move away from you must have published 1 or perhaps even 2 books, which no one will read except for your assessment panel, and rather you have to other kinds of publication, whether it's internet publishing on the internet, publishing in journals,